The air of the international terminal wasn't merely filled, it was thick with a cacophony that pressed in from all sides. A low, persistent thrum of jet engines vibrated through the floor, a constant counterpoint to the rush of thousands of hurried feet. Announcements, multilingual and often garbled, echoed from unseen speakers, blending with the excited chatter of departing families, the clipped phone calls of business travelers, and the distant tinny music from a duty-free shop. The entire space pulsed with an almost organic energy, a beast of steel and glass breathing the breath of humanity. It was a place of transit, a temporary nexus where countless individual narratives intersected for a fleeting moment before diverging once more into the vastness of the sky. Amidst this orchestrated chaos, Mr. Silas stood patiently. His posture, though slightly stooped with age, retained a quiet dignity. His eyes, set deep within a network of gentle wrinkles, held a serene intelligence as they observed the swirling currents of people around him. A well-worn fedora, its brim slightly misshapen from years of loyal service, rested on his head, a silent sentinel against the world's harsh glare. He clutched a small, scuffed leather suitcase in one hand, its brass clasp dulled with time, its surface bearing the faint scars of countless journeys. It wasn't merely old. It looked like an extension of him, a silent companion on a long road. The security line snaked ahead, a testament to modern anxieties and bureaucratic meticulousness. A young woman, her face a mask of exasperation, fumbled with a plastic bag of liquids. Behind her, a booming voice bellowed into a phone, oblivious to the proximity of others. Mr. Silas watched them all, his gaze uncritical, almost contemplative. He didn't fidget, didn't sigh with impatience. He merely existed in the moment, a still point in a turning world. His turn came. A stern-faced security officer, broad-shouldered and with a close-cropped haircut, gestured him forward with a curt flick of the wrist. "Belt off, shoes off, all electronics out, liquids in the bag," the officer rattled off, his voice flat, practiced. Mr. Silas, without a word, began the familiar ritual. His movements were slow, deliberate. He untied the laces of his sensible walking shoes, carefully removed his hat, revealing a thinning crown of white hair, and unbuckled the leather belt that had held up his trousers for decades. Each item was placed with a quiet precision into a gray plastic bin. The old suitcase, too, went onto the conveyor belt, disappearing into the dark maw of the X-ray machine. As he stepped through the metal detector, it blared its insistent warning. The officer, whose name tag read Jenkins, sighed loudly. "What have you got on you, sir?" he demanded, his tone edged with an impatience that bordered on aggression. "Nothing, young man. Mister." Silas replied, his voice a soft rasp, a whisper against the airport's roar. "Just myself." Jenkins' eyes narrowed. He motioned to another officer, a younger woman with a perpetually bored expression. "Pat down," he ordered, his gaze fixed on Mr. Silas with an almost predatory intensity. The pat-down was thorough, unnecessarily so. The young officer's hands were rough, probing, lingering in places that made Mr. Silas flinch almost imperceptibly. He stood his ground, maintaining his quiet dignity, but a faint blush crept up his neck. The other passengers in line, a captive audience, began to shift their weight, some casting quick, uncomfortable glances away, others staring openly, a flicker of curiosity or mild amusement in their eyes. A child pointed, asking loudly, "Mommy, what's wrong with that old man?" Jenkins wasn't finished. "Anything else, sir? Any prosthetics, medical implants?" His voice was louder now, designed to be heard by those waiting to make an example. "Mr." Silas's brow furrowed slightly. "No, nothing of the sort." "All right, well, the bag needs a secondary inspection," Jenkins announced, picking up the small suitcase from the end of the conveyor belt. He placed it on a metal table, snapped open the latches, and rummaged through its contents with a brusqueness that seemed calculated to cause maximum disruption. A meticulously folded shirt was pulled out, then a slim, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. A small wooden carving of a bird, smooth and worn from years of handling, was picked up, turned over, and then dropped back into the case with a clatter. The humiliation was palpable. Mr. Silas stood bareheaded, his shoes off, his belt in a bin, watching his private world exposed to the indifferent gaze of strangers. A tremor, barely perceptible, ran through his hands. He swallowed hard. Unbeknownst to the unfolding scene, a small group of individuals, distinct from the usual airport crowd, watched from a coffee shop some 50 yards away. They wore civilian clothes, jeans, t-shirts, baseball caps, but their posture, their focused intensity, marked them as anything but ordinary tourists. They were a SEAL team on a brief layover, their senses honed to the subtle rhythms of their surroundings. Captain Miller, a man whose face was etched with the quiet authority of command, was sipping lukewarm coffee, scanning the security line with an almost unconscious vigilance. "Look at that old guy," one of his team, a burly man named Jax, muttered, nodding towards Mr. Silas. "They're really giving him the business." Miller's gaze sharpened. He watched as Jenkins roughly handled the old man's belongings. There was something in the old man's stillness, his quiet endurance, that resonated with something deep within Miller. He'd seen that particular brand of resilience before. Then, as Jenkins pulled out a small tarnished silver compass from a hidden pocket within the suitcase lining, turning it over in his hand with a sneer, Miller's breath hitched. The compass. His eyes widened, a jolt of recognition shooting through him. That specific compass, with its distinctive markings, its faded engraving, impossible. A memory flashed vivid and sudden, a young Miller, barely more than a boy, shivering in a snow-covered mountain pass, his comms dead, his team scattered, a figure emerging from the whiteout, a ghost in the storm, guiding him with an unwavering certainty, a quiet strength that defied the elements, and in his hand, that compass. "You always know your true north, son," the voice had said, calm amidst the howling wind, "even when the world tries to spin you around." Miller slammed his coffee cup down. The clatter made his team jump. "Silas!" he barked, his voice low, but carrying an unmistakable urgency that cut through the airport's drone. "That's Silas!" Jax and the others snapped to attention, their casual postures evaporating, replaced by an instant coiled readiness. They followed Miller's gaze to the old man, now being subjected to a condescending lecture from Jenkins about undeclared items. "Silas?" Jax whispered, his eyes widening in disbelief. "The ghost?" Another team member, Rook, a quiet sharpshooter, felt a chill run down his spine. The ghost. The legend. The man whose name was spoken in hushed tones in every elite unit across the globe. The one who had vanished without a trace decades ago, leaving behind a legacy of impossible missions, an unparalleled skill. "He's being humiliated," Miller growled, his jaw tight, "right in front of everyone." The team didn't need further orders. They moved as one, a swift fluid unit cutting through the oblivious crowd. The shift in their demeanor was immediate, startling. The casual civilians transformed into a focused, determined force, their faces grim, their eyes locked on the scene at security. Jenkins was still lecturing Mr. Silas, holding the compass up as if it were a suspicious device. "And what exactly is this, sir? Some kind of antique?" Before Mr. Silas could answer, a hand, strong and deliberate, clamped down on Jenkins' shoulder. Jenkins spun around, ready to snap, but his words died in his throat as he met the steely gaze of Captain Miller. "That, officer," Miller said, his voice dangerously quiet, "is a piece of history, and you, sir, are addressing a living legend." The other SEALs fanned out, creating an almost invisible perimeter, their presence radiating an unspoken authority that made the surrounding passengers instinctively step back. The airport hum seemed to diminish, replaced by a sudden electric silence in their immediate vicinity. Jenkins, flustered, looked from Miller to Mr. Silas, then back again. Who are you people?" he stammered, his bravado crumbling. Miller didn't answer him directly. Instead, he met Mr. Silas's eyes. A lifetime of shared understanding passed between them in that single glance. Mr. Silas, for the first time, allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to touch his lips. The humiliation, the indignity, began to recede, replaced by something warm and profoundly validating. The crowd, which had moments before been indifferent or mildly curious, now watched with rapt attention. They saw the transformation in Jenkins' face, The sudden deference from the security officers, the quiet reverence emanating from the powerful men surrounding the old man. The narrative in their minds shifted instantly. The problematic old man became something else entirely. A hero, a figure of immense unspoken importance. Miller gently took the compass from Jenkins' trembling hand and returned it to Mr. Silas. "Sir," he said, his voice filled with a profound respect, "it is an honor." Mr. Silas merely nodded, his kind eyes now sparkling with a flicker of something akin to amusement, a deep, knowing warmth. The weight of the airport's gaze, once so heavy with judgment, now felt different. It was still there, but now it was tinged with wonder, with curiosity, perhaps even with a nascent, dawning admiration. The silent crowd, having witnessed the old man's public shaming, now bore witness to his quiet, powerful validation. The hum of the airport for a moment seemed to hold its breath. The stern guard, the security line, a serpentine coil of weary travelers, finally disgorged Mr. Silas at its head. The fluorescent lights of the terminal hummed with an almost aggressive cheerfulness, reflecting off the polished linoleum floor and the myriad of weary, anxious faces. The air, thick with the scent of cheap coffee and disinfectant, seemed to press in on him. His old suitcase, now returned to him but bearing the faint, unlovely imprint of Jenkins's rough handling, felt heavier than before. Before him stood Officer Reynolds, a man whose presence alone seemed to drain the warmth from the already sterile environment. Reynolds was a formidable figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with a meticulously pressed uniform that spoke of an almost fanatical dedication to order. His dark hair was cut short, military style, and his jaw was perpetually set in a grim line, as if he found the very act of existing a constant source of irritation. A pair of wire-rimmed glasses perched precariously on his aquiline nose, magnifying the sternness in his eyes. He surveyed the queue with a practiced, almost bored disdain, his gaze sweeping over each person as if assessing their potential for disruption. When his eyes landed on Mr. Silas, they narrowed imperceptibly. There was no flicker of recognition, no hint of the profound shift that had just occurred mere yards away. To Reynolds, Mr. Silas was just another elderly passenger, another potential delay in the relentless procession of human cargo. A faint frown, a permanent fixture on Reynolds' brow, deepened slightly. He seemed to view Mr. Silas's quiet dignity, his slightly rumpled clothes, and the telltale weariness in his posture as personal affronts to the efficiency he so meticulously upheld. Mr. Silas, for his part, met Reynolds' gaze with a quiet resolve. He had faced down far more imposing figures in his time, figures armed with more than just a badge and an ill temper. Yet, the familiar knot of apprehension tightened in his stomach. The airport, with its incessant demands for compliance and its public scrutiny, had always been a crucible of sorts for him. He preferred the shadows, the unspoken agreements, the quiet certainty of purpose. This public arena, however, forced him into the glaring light, where every movement, every hesitation was subject to judgment. Reynolds' gaze lingered on the compass clutched in Mr. Silas's hand, though he didn't seem to recognize its significance. He merely saw it as an object that hadn't been placed in the bin, another rule perhaps being skirted. His lips, thin and bloodless, parted. "Next!" Reynolds barked, the single word echoing through the immediate vicinity of the checkpoint, sharp and unyielding. It wasn't an invitation. It was a command, a declaration that the encounter had begun, and it would proceed entirely on his terms. The sound was abrasive, cutting through the low murmur of the crowd and causing a few nearby passengers to flinch. It hung in the air, a stark pronouncement of the authority Reynolds wielded, however minor in the grand scheme of things. Mr. Silas took a slow, deliberate breath. He moved forward, stepping onto the designated mat, the worn leather of his shoes squeaking faintly against the polished floor. The hum of the X-ray machine seemed to intensify, a low, mechanical growl that promised scrutiny and exposure. He placed his suitcase on the conveyor belt, the act performed with a careful precision that belied the tremor in his hands. The tarnished silver compass, still nestled in his palm, felt suddenly heavy, a small, cold anchor in the rising tide of Reynolds' impatience. He could feel the weight of Reynolds' gaze upon him, a palpable pressure that seemed to strip away any pretense of privacy. The officer's eyes, magnified behind the wire-rimmed glasses, seemed to bore into him, searching for any telltale sign of irregularity, any deviation from the prescribed norm. Reynolds tapped his fingers impatiently against the counter, a staccato rhythm that grated on Mr. Silas's nerves. "Everything out of your pockets, sir," Reynolds commanded, his voice devoid of any warmth or civility, a stark contrast to the deferential tone the SEAL team now carried for Mr. Silas. "Keys, wallet, anything metallic. And that little trinket, too." He gestured dismissively at the compass, his expression conveying utter contempt for its apparent sentimental value. The word trinket felt like a direct insult, a deliberate attempt to diminish something precious. Mr. Silas hesitated, his thumb caressing the smooth, worn surface of the compass. To part with it, even for a moment, felt like severing a vital connection. It was more than a tool. It was a touchstone, a repository of memories and unspoken promises. But he knew, with a weary certainty, that defiance would only escalate the situation. He recognized the type: small men in uniforms, inflated by the petty authority of their position, who thrived on confrontation and the subjugation of others. With a sigh that was barely audible above the airport din, Mr. Silas released his grip on the compass. He placed it gently into the plastic bin, alongside his wallet and keys. The metallic clang of the items against the plastic, sounding disproportionately loud in the tense silence. He straightened, his shoulders back, his eyes meeting Reynolds' unflinching gaze. The confrontation had begun in earnest, and Mr. Silas knew, with a deep-seated weariness, that it was only going to get harder. The stripping down. "Next," Officer Reynolds barked, her voice cutting through the dull hum of the security line. She gestured with a sharp flick of her wrist toward Silas, who was still standing by the conveyor belt, his hand hovering over the empty bin where his compass now lay. "Shoes, hat, belt, everything off." Silas blinked slowly, his gaze drifting from the bin to the officer, then to his worn leather shoes. A tremor ran through his hand, barely perceptible, as he reached for the brim of his fedora. The felt was smooth beneath his fingertips, a familiar comfort. He removed it with deliberate slowness, revealing a sparse crown of white hair, meticulously combed but now slightly ruffled. He placed the hat gently into a waiting bin, the soft material muffling the faint clatter of his compass from the one beside it. Reynolds tapped her foot an impatient staccato against the polished floor. "And the belt, sir. Let's keep this moving." Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, scanned the line of passengers behind Silas, a silent warning against any potential slowdowns. A young woman with a screaming toddler strapped to her chest shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting between Silas and the stern officer. A businessman in a crisp suit checked his watch, a sigh escaping his lips. Silas's fingers, gnarled with age, fumbled with the buckle of his belt. The leather was supple, worn smooth from years of use, the brass buckle tarnished but gleaming faintly under the harsh fluorescent lights. His movements were hesitant, each action a conscious effort. He could feel the weight of Reynolds' gaze, a palpable pressure that seemed to drain the strength from his limbs. The metallic tang of fear, or perhaps just profound weariness, brushed the back of his throat. He finally managed to unfasten the buckle, the soft rasp of leather sliding through loops echoing in the sudden quiet that seemed to have fallen over their immediate vicinity. He carefully coiled the belt, his hand shaking slightly, and placed it next to his hat. The small collection of personal items, the compass, the fedora, the belt, lay exposed in the sterile plastic bin, a stark testament to the stripping away of his privacy. He felt a peculiar nakedness, not of flesh, but of identity. These were not just objects. They were extensions of him, small anchors in a world that often felt adrift. From a discreet distance, near a duty-free shop, a group of 6 men in civilian clothes observed the scene. They wore plain, practical attire, but there was an unmistakable intensity in their posture, a coiled readiness that set them apart. Their eyes, though seemingly casual, missed nothing. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a scar above his left eyebrow, idly picked up a bottle of expensive whiskey, but his gaze remained fixed on the elderly man by the security checkpoint. Reynolds, seeing Silas still standing there, arms hanging loosely at his sides, narrowed her eyes. "Shoes, sir. Unless you plan on going through barefoot." Her tone dripped with thinly veiled contempt, a deliberate attempt to assert her authority and shame him into faster compliance. Silas looked down at his shoes, practical Oxfords, scuffed but well maintained. Bending was a slower process now, the joints in his knees protesting with a soft ache. He braced one hand on the edge of the conveyor belt, feeling the vibration of the moving machinery beneath his palm, and slowly lowered himself. The task of untying the laces seemed monumental, his fingers stiff and uncooperative. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, a mix of impatience, pity, and a morbid curiosity. A woman in a vibrant headscarf averted her gaze, a flicker of empathy in her expression. The businessman, however, simply rolled his eyes. As Silas finally slipped off his shoes, revealing thin, dark socks, he heard a sharp intake of breath from the direction of the duty-free shop. The broad-shouldered man who had been holding the whiskey bottle suddenly dropped it. It hit the carpeted floor with a muffled thud, no one seeming to notice but his team. His eyes, now wide with an almost disbelieving recognition, locked onto Silas. A single word, barely a whisper, escaped his lips. Silas. The other 5 men instantly snapped to attention. Their casual demeanor vanished, replaced by an electrifying alertness. They followed the broad-shouldered man's gaze to the elderly figure, stooped and vulnerable, by the security scanner. A collective jolt went through the team. "Is that?" one of them started, his voice hushed. The broad-shouldered man didn't answer. He didn't need to. A network of scars, faint but unmistakable, crisscrossed the back of Silas's left hand as he placed his shoes into the bin. It was a signature, a battlefield tattoo earned in a forgotten conflict, a mark known only to a select few. "Alpha 6, move!" the broad-shouldered man barked, his voice no longer a whisper but a command, sharp and urgent. In an instant, the 6 men dropped everything. The facade of casual travelers shattered. Their movement was fluid, synchronized, a practiced blur of motion. They surged forward, not running, but moving with an intensity that screamed purpose, their eyes fixed on the man who was once a legend, now reduced to an old man struggling with his shoelaces. The airport, with its mundane rituals and indifferent crowds, was about to become something else entirely. Reynolds, momentarily distracted by a snag in the scanner belt, looked up, her expression tightening as she saw the group of men rapidly approaching. "Hey, what do you think you're—" Her words were cut off as the leading man, his face a mask of fierce determination, brushed past her without a glance. Silas, still bent over, felt a sudden shift in the air, a ripple of energy that was both familiar and unsettling. He straightened slowly, his eyes narrowing, and turned just as the first of the men reached him. "Sir?" The broad-shouldered man, his voice thick with emotion, stood before him, his posture deferential, yet his eyes shone with an almost reverent awe. Silas looked at the man, his gaze piercing, a flicker of something ancient and unyielding returning to his eyes. Recognition dawned, slow and profound. "Sergeant Thorne," he murmured, his voice a low rasp. The airport, which moments before had been a stage for a petty humiliation, was suddenly charged with a different kind of tension. The other passengers, who had been watching Silas with a mix of indifference and discomfort, now exchanged confused glances. The screaming toddler quieted, sensing the abrupt change, as the businessman's jaw dropped. Officer Reynolds stood frozen, her authoritarian mask cracking, utterly bewildered by the sudden, inexplicable shift in the atmosphere. The stripping down was over, but something far more significant had just begun. The beeping alarm. The metallic shriek from the archway cleaved the air, a jarring intrusion that made several passengers flinch. Silas, halfway through, paused, a slight tremor in his hand that now clutched his boarding pass. Officer Reynolds, already hovering with a practiced impatience, threw his hands up in a gesture of utter exasperation. "Again?" he grumbled, his voice a low growl of annoyance. He rolled his eyes, a theatrical display of bewilderment at the elderly man's apparent inability to comply with the simplest of security procedures. Silas offered a weak, apologetic smile, his eyes darting to the small queue forming behind him. A young mother shifted her baby. A businessman checked his watch. A trio of teenagers giggled quietly. The collective weight of their mild irritation pressed down on him. He stepped back, the alarm instantly silenced. "Anything in your pockets, sir?" Reynolds asked, his tone clipped, barely concealing his mounting frustration. His gaze swept over Silas, a dismissive flick that lingered for a fraction too long on the worn fabric of his jacket. "No, everything's in the tray," Silas replied, his voice a soft rasp, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of something more profound than mere inconvenience. He gestured to the plastic bin, where his wallet, watch, and a small, nondescript metal pen lay. Reynolds sighed, a loud, theatrical expulsion of air that seemed to deflate the very atmosphere around them. "All right. Through again, please. Slowly this time." The word slowly was drawn out, laced with a patronizing edge that rankled. Silas complied, his movements deliberate, almost painfully so. He shuffled forward, each step an act of cautious navigation through the invisible force field of the detector. As he neared the center, the machine erupted once more, a banshee wail that echoed off the high ceilings of the terminal. This time, Reynolds didn't sigh. He simply stared, his jaw tightening, a vein throbbing faintly in his temple. The brief flicker of bewilderment in his eyes gave way to a hardened, almost aggressive glint. He barked at a colleague to handle the growing line, then turned back to Silas, his stance more rigid, his shoulders squaring. "All right, sir, this is getting ridiculous," Reynolds stated, his voice now devoid of any pretense of politeness. "We're going to have to do a more thorough pat-down." Silas braced himself, though he offered no protest. He simply closed his eyes for a fleeting second, a near imperceptible tightening of his lips the only outward sign of his discomfort. Reynolds approached, his movements sharp and precise. He began at Silas's shoulders, his hands pressing firmly, almost aggressively, along the seams of his jacket. The search was no longer a routine procedure. It was an interrogation conducted through touch. His fingers delved into pockets that Silas had already emptied, prodding and kneading the fabric with an almost punitive force. Silas winced as Reynolds' hand slammed against his lower back, a jolt of pain shooting through his spine. He bit back a gasp, his breath catching in his throat. The officer's hands moved down his legs, pressing hard against his thighs, then his shins, the tips of his fingers digging into the muscle and bone. Each touch was an invasion, a physical manifestation of the humiliation he was enduring. A ripple went through the small crowd of onlookers. The young mother averted her gaze, her expression a mix of pity and discomfort. The businessman, initially annoyed, now watched with a more curious, almost concerned frown. The teenagers had stopped giggling, their faces reflecting a sudden, uncomfortable seriousness. Reynolds, oblivious or uncaring of the effect he was having, continued his relentless search. He ran his hands along Silas's arms, his fingers pressing into the old man's bicep, then his forearm. The movement was less a search for contraband and more an exercise in dominance. Silas's shoulders slumped, his frame seeming to shrink under the harsh scrutiny. He felt a dull ache spreading through his ribs, a phantom pain from a memory long buried, now stirred by the rough handling. "Anything else you'd like to declare, sir?" Reynolds asked, his voice laced with a cold sarcasm. His face just inches from Silas's, a slight sheen of sweat on his brow. The officer's frustration had curdled into something uglier, a punitive edge that left Silas feeling exposed and vulnerable. The humiliation was a tangible weight pressing down on him, stripping away his dignity with each aggressive touch. Watching eyes. The terminal's ambient drone tightened, drawing focus to the escalating scene at the security checkpoint. Some passengers trapped in the serpentine queue averted their gazes, their discomfort a tangible presence as they feigned interest in the polished floor or the flickering departure board. Others, perhaps bolder or merely less inhibited, openly gawked, phones angled to capture the unfolding spectacle with detached curiosity. A young woman, earbuds sealing her off, scrolled through social media, oblivious to the drama feet away. A businessman, sharp in his suit, consulted his watch, a flicker of impatience crossing his features as the delay threatened his meticulously charted day. A little girl, no older than 5, clutching a well-loved teddy bear, tugged her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, why is that man sad?" she whispered, her voice piercing the sudden hush. Her small, plump finger aimed directly at Silas, who, despite the indignity, maintained a stoic, almost empty expression. Her mother, a harried woman with dark circles etched beneath her eyes, swiftly lowered the child's hand, her cheeks coloring. "Don't point, sweetie," she murmured, offering Silas a fleeting, apologetic glance before disappearing behind her phone screen. The brief incident sent a fresh ripple of awkwardness through the immediate vicinity. Officer Reynolds, emboldened by the lack of intervention and perhaps spurred by the passive audience, pressed his advantage. His voice, now edged with punitive authority, sliced through the background noise. "Empty your pockets, sir. Everything. Now." Silas, his movements slow and deliberate, began to comply, his hands trembling almost imperceptibly as he fumbled with the worn leather of his wallet. A few crumpled bills, a faded photograph of a woman with kind eyes, and a seasoned military identification card emerged. Reynolds snatched the ID without ceremony, scanning it with a dismissive grunt before tossing it back onto the tray. The card skittered across the plastic, settling precariously close to the edge. Silas watched it, an unreadable flicker in his eyes, before retrieving it with a gentle touch, as if handling something infinitely precious. A few dozen yards away, nestled in a corner of the terminal's bustling coffee shop, Alex Spector. Miller nursed a lukewarm latte. His team, a tightly knit unit of SEALs, sprawled around a small table, their conversation a low current, punctuated by the clatter of ceramic and the hiss of the espresso machine. Off duty, they blended with the civilian crowd, though their underlying alertness was a subtle tell. Alex, ever observant, let his gaze drift across the terminal, taking in the human tide. His keen, intelligent eyes registered details most people missed: the slight hitch in a man's gait, the nervous tics of a woman awaiting her flight. He noticed the commotion at the security checkpoint, a knot of people gathering, but initially dismissed it as routine airport drama. Likely another passenger disputing liquid restrictions or an overweight bag. "Think we'll make it back before the storm hits?" One of his teammates, a burly man named Hammer, grunted, stirring his coffee with a plastic spoon. Alex took a sip of his latte, the bitterness a welcome counterpoint to the sweet pastry he'd just consumed. "Weather looks clear for now, Hammer. We'll be home before you can even conjure a thought of your couch." A faint smile touched his lips, yet his attention remained subtly tethered to the security area. The officer's voice carried a little too much aggression. The elderly man, he noted, was small, almost fragile, but his stiff posture held a quiet resilience. There was something in his measured movements, the economy of his gestures that resonated with Alex's highly trained mind. It was a familiar pattern, a silent discipline that spoke of a life forged with purpose. He saw the little girl point and the mother's swift, embarrassed recoil. He saw Silas's face, etched with the lines of age and experience, yet devoid of self-pity. There was a dignity there, even under duress, that echoed something deep within Alex. He'd witnessed that same quiet strength in the eyes of men who'd faced unthinkable odds, men who bore the weight of unspeakable burdens with unwavering resolve. The sight of Silas retrieving his military ID from the tray, the almost reverent way he handled it, sent a jolt through Alex. His casual observation sharpened into a focused intensity. He couldn't discern the specifics of the exchange, but the aggressive posture of the officer, the way he loomed over the elderly man, was unmistakable. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Alex leaned forward, elbows on the table, his eyes riveted on Silas. A cold knot tightened in his stomach. He'd seen that ID before, or one very much like it, on the rare occasions when men of a certain caliber, those who operated in the deepest shadows, carried any identification at all. He watched as Silas, in a slow, almost imperceptible motion, adjusted his jacket, the movement revealing, for a fleeting second, the worn leather of a shoulder holster beneath. It was a faint, almost invisible detail designed to be missed, but Alex didn't miss it. His breath hitched. The coffee shop's chatter, the clatter of plates, the general din of the terminal, all faded into a distant hum. Alex's world narrowed to the small, tense drama at the security checkpoint. His mind, usually a whirlwind of strategic thought, became unnervingly still. He knew that posture. He knew that silent endurance. He knew that type of man. A name, whispered in hushed tones in briefing rooms and on dusty battlefields, echoed in the silent chambers of his memory. The ghost. His eyes snapped to his team. "Eyes up," he murmured, his voice low, but carrying an unmistakable command. The casual ease instantly evaporated from his teammates, replaced by their characteristic combat readiness. They followed his gaze, their expressions morphing from relaxed to alert in unison. The scattered past officer Reynolds, fueled by an almost theatrical sense of authority and the silent complicity of the indifferent crowd, gestured sharply towards Silas's well-traveled olive-green canvas suitcase. "Open it. Now." His voice, thick with unearned power, cut through the low hum of the terminal. Silas, his face an unreadable mask, slowly unlatched the two worn buckles. The metal gave a faint, reluctant click. He lifted the lid, revealing a neatly folded array of simple, functional clothes, a few shirts, a pair of trousers, and a small leather-bound book. Everything spoke of a life lived with purpose, devoid of excess. Reynolds, however, wasn't interested in neatness. With a grunt of disdain, he grabbed the case and upended it onto the cold stainless steel table. The contents spilled out in a chaotic tumble. The folded clothes unraveled, the leather book landed with a soft thud, and amidst the mundane, a small square object slid across the polished surface. It was a photograph, its edges softened by countless years of handling, its colors faded to sepia tones. It landed face up, revealing a young woman with a radiant smile and eyes that sparkled with life. Her dark hair was swept back from a heart-shaped face, and she wore a simple, elegant dress. Her gaze, even in the faded image, seemed to meet Silas's, with an intimacy that transcended time and space. For the first time since the ordeal began, a tremor ran through Silas's stoic composure. His eyes, which had been fixed on some distant point beyond the chaotic scene, now narrowed, focusing entirely on the image. A barely perceptible catch in his breath, a fleeting flicker of something profound. Grief, tenderness, crossed his face, instantly gone. like a shadow disappearing in a blink. His hand, which had been resting loosely at his side, rose, slow and deliberate, towards the photograph. The movement was almost imperceptible, yet to Alex Miller, watching intently from his vantage point across the concourse, it was a seismic event. Alex had seen Silas's military ID, had clocked the subtle bulge beneath his jacket that hinted at the shoulder holster, and had recognized the quiet intensity in the man's eyes. This wasn't just an old man. This was the ghost. And now, this photograph had momentarily peeled back a layer of that legendary composure. Silas's fingers, gnarled with age but still possessing a surprising dexterity, brushed against the worn surface of the photo. He picked it up, holding it with an almost reverent delicacy, his thumb gently tracing the contours of the young woman's face. For a fleeting moment, the roar of the airport, the impatient shuffling of the queue, the aggressive posturing of Officer Reynolds, all seemed to fade into an indistinct hum. There was only Silas, the photograph, and the ghost of a smile playing on his lips, a private moment unfolding in the heart of a public spectacle. Reynolds, however, had no patience for private moments. His eyes, cold and devoid of empathy, registered only the pause, the distraction. He lunged forward, his hand snapping out like a viper. "What's this? More contraband?" he sneered, his voice dripping with suspicion. Before Silas could even react, the photograph was snatched from his grasp. The sudden, violent motion caused a tremor that ran through Silas's entire frame, his hand remaining suspended in the air for a moment, as if still cradling the absent image. The fleeting emotion on his face vanished, replaced by an even deeper, more impenetrable mask. But the brief vulnerability had been noted, filed away by the observant eyes of Alex Miller. Reynolds held the photograph aloft, scrutinizing it with an air of theatrical suspicion. "Who is she? Your accomplice?" he barked, his voice echoing off the high ceilings of the terminal. The words, intended to humiliate, landed with the thud of a dull blade against a shield of steel. Silas offered no response, his gaze now fixed on some point beyond Reynolds, beyond the airport, perhaps beyond this world. Alex, meanwhile, had subtly shifted his position, his eyes never leaving Silas. The brief glimpse of emotion, the almost imperceptible tremor, the way Silas had held that photograph, it all resonated with something deep within Alex, something he understood about the weight of a life lived on the edge, the hidden anchors that kept a person grounded. He signaled to his team a series of quick, almost invisible gestures. The message was clear: move closer but maintain cover. The situation was escalating, and the ghost was involved. Reynolds, finding no obvious threat in the faded image, crumpled it slightly in his hand before tossing it carelessly back onto the table where it landed amid Silas's scattered belongings. "Nothing to see here," he declared, his voice dismissive, yet still laced with a lingering frustrated aggression. "Just an old man and his memories." The word was spat out, as if memories themselves were a form of contraband. Silas remained silent, his gaze unwavering. He had lost the photograph, but not his dignity. His eyes, however, now held a glint, a subtle hardening that Alex recognized as the quiet prelude to something decisive. The game was changing. A flash of memory. The acrid tang of burnt coffee suddenly tasted like ash in Alex's mouth. He gagged, a small, involuntary noise lost amidst the din of the terminal, but sharp enough to draw a glance from Sergeant Hayes beside him. Alex ignored it, his gaze now locked on the old man and the security officer. The casual disregard with which Reynolds had tossed the photograph, a moment of intimate vulnerability exposed and then callously dismissed, had struck a dissonant chord. But it was more than just the rudeness. It was the old man's reaction, or rather the lack thereof. A flicker of something, yes. In his eyes, a depth of emotion so profound it seemed to pull at the very air around him, but no outward flinch, no protest. Just a hardening of the jaw, a subtle clenching of hands that spoke volumes to Alex's trained eye. Then, as Reynolds leaned closer, his voice a low, threatening rumble, Alex saw it. A slight shift in the old man's worn tweed jacket just beneath the left armpit. A faint, almost imperceptible outline. It was a familiar contour, one that screamed of concealed purpose. Not a wallet, not a travel document. It was the unmistakable, compact bulk of a shoulder holster. A jolt like a current of electricity shot through Alex. His coffee cup clattered against the saucer, spilling a dark ring onto the pristine white tabletop. Hayes raised an eyebrow, a silent query. Alex didn't even register it. His breath hitched, held captive in his chest. Ghost. The word exploded in his mind, not a thought, but a visceral, overwhelming sensation. A flash, blindingly bright, ripped through the carefully constructed present, tearing open a wound of memory he hadn't realized was still bleeding. The air shifted, the hum of the airport fading, replaced by the gritty whisper of desert wind. The scent of stale coffee dissolved into the dry metallic tang of dust and cordite. The polished floors of the terminal vanished, supplanted by the cracked, sun-baked earth of a makeshift training camp in the unforgiving expanse of the Nevada desert. He was younger, barely out of basic, a raw recruit with a fire in his belly and too much to prove. He remembered the heat, a relentless, oppressive blanket that baked the very thoughts in his skull. His uniform, stiff and new, clung to his sweat-drenched skin, chafing in a dozen places. The world, then, was a relentless cycle of physical exertion and mental conditioning, a crucible designed to forge boys into men, and men into something more. He stood in a line of equally exhausted recruits, sand gritty between his teeth, watching a figure move with an almost supernatural grace. The man was older even then, not old in the way of the man at security, but with the weathered lines of experience etched around his eyes, a quiet authority that vibrated in the air around him. He wasn't loud, didn't bark orders, yet his presence commanded absolute attention. This was the legendary Ghost, a name whispered with reverence and awe amongst the greenhorns, a man whose exploits were already the stuff of legend within the elite units. Ghost was demonstrating close-quarters combat, his movements fluid and economical, each strike, each block, a testament to years of honed instinct. He moved like smoke, like a wraith, appearing and disappearing with uncanny speed. Alex remembered trying to emulate that effortless flow, his own movements clumsy and overextended by comparison. "Relax, Miller." Ghost's voice had been a low murmur, barely audible above the wind, yet it cut through the din of training. He had materialized beside Alex, his hands calloused and strong, gently correcting Alex's stance. "The fight isn't about brute force. It's about efficiency, about making every movement count. You become the space, the shadow. You flow." Alex had nodded, his heart pounding, a mix of awe and frustration warring within him. He'd never encountered anyone like Ghost. The man seemed to see through him into the very core of his intentions. There was a quiet intensity in Ghost's eyes, a depth that spoke of battles fought and losses borne, yet also a profound, unwavering resilience. It was a look Alex had only ever seen in the eyes of men who had stared into the abyss and walked away. Changed but unbroken, he remembered a particular exercise, a night raid simulation. The camp was plunged into artificial darkness, the air thick with the smell of simulated smoke and the tension of anticipation. Alex, tasked with infiltrating a mock enemy stronghold, had been convinced he was invisible, moving with what he thought was stealth. Then, A hand had clamped down on his shoulder, startling him so completely he nearly cried out. Ghost. He had appeared from nowhere, a silent phantom. Too much noise, Miller, he'd whispered, his voice a rustle in the dark. You telegraph your intentions. Learn to breathe with the night. Become one with it. He then proceeded to demonstrate, melting back into the shadows with such seamless grace that Alex genuinely couldn't tell where he had gone. It was a lesson that had stayed with Alex, etched into his very being. The memory was so vivid, so real, that Alex almost felt the rough fabric of his old uniform beneath his fingers. He could almost taste the desert dust, hear the quiet, authoritative rasp of Ghost's voice. And then, as abruptly as it had arrived, the flashback shattered. The sounds of the airport rushed back in, a cacophony of voices and rolling luggage. The smell of coffee, now cold and bitter, assaulted his nostrils. The harsh fluorescent lights of the terminal replaced the desert sun. Officer Reynolds, still barking at the old man, loomed large in his vision, and the old man, Silas. It was him. The same quiet dignity, the same profound depth in his eyes, the same unwavering resolve in the set of his jaw. Older, yes, years had weathered him, but the essence, the core of the legendary Ghost, remained unmistakably intact. Alex's breath finally released in a ragged gasp. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of recognition and dawning horror. This wasn't just an old man being humiliated. This was Ghost, and he was being subjected to this travesty. A primal urge, hot and fierce, surged through Alex. He pushed back from the table, his chair scraping loudly, drawing the immediate sharp attention of his team. The Ghost's shadow. The desert sun beat down, a relentless anvil striking the earth, but Ghost moved with an almost ethereal grace, a phantom among the shimmering heat haze. Alex, then a fresh-faced recruit, remembered the first time he'd seen Silas in action. They were pinned down, a simulated ambush gone sideways, the air thick with the crack of blanks and the acrid smell of spent gunpowder. Ghost, younger then, but already with that same steely glint in his eyes, had been a whirlwind of controlled violence. He'd moved through the chaos like a whisper, a shadow flitting between rocks, before reappearing behind the enemy line, effectively neutralizing the threat before anyone else had even fully processed their predicament. His movements were precise, economical, every motion serving a purpose, every breath a calculated part of the symphony of survival. Silas wasn't just a trainer, he was a legend, whispered in hushed tones around campfires and in dimly lit briefing rooms. They called him Ghost because he was there, and then he wasn't, leaving only a ripple in the air. He taught them to see the world differently, to perceive the subtle shifts, the almost imperceptible tells that separated life from death. He drilled them relentlessly, pushing them past their perceived limits, his calm, authoritative voice a constant presence. Observe, adapt, overcome, he'd intoned, his words etched into Alex's very being. There was one particular memory that always stood out, a moment seared into Alex's memory like a brand. They were on a live fire exercise, a complex urban simulation, when a ricochet from a poorly aimed shot had sent a shower of concrete shrapnel toward Alex's head. He'd frozen, a deer in the headlights, the world narrowing to the whistling sound of the fragments. In a blur, Ghost had materialized, an arm like an iron band around Alex's chest, pulling him backward with such force that Alex's feet left the ground. The shrapnel had peppered the wall where Alex's head had been moments before. Ghost hadn't said a word, merely offered a curt nod before pushing Alex back into the fray, the message clear. Hesitation kills. That decisive, instantaneous action, that unflappable calm in the face of danger, had saved Alex's life. Now, Watching the humiliation unfold, the memories coalesced, flooding Alex with a sickening wave of recognition and fury. The old man, so quiet, so unassuming, was the same man who had forged him, who had instilled in him the very principles of dignity and self-respect that were now being so brazenly trampled. The hidden holster, the subtle tension in Silas's shoulders as the officer's hands explored, the way his gaze flickered, not in fear but in assessment, it all clicked into place. This wasn't just some old man. This was Ghost. Alex's hand, clutching the lukewarm coffee cup, clenched. The plastic groaned under the sudden pressure. A red mist seemed to descend, blurring the edges of his vision. The calm detachment he usually maintained in public spaces shattered into a million pieces. The disrespect, the sheer audacity of this petty tyrant to lay hands on him, on Ghost, boiled over. The injustice was a physical punch to Alex's gut. His chair scraped back with a violent shriek as Alex launched himself to his feet. The coffee cup, forgotten, tipped precariously, then cascaded to the floor, splashing hot liquid across the pristine airport tiles. It sent up a miniature geyser of dark brown, staining the polished surface. The sudden noise, the sharp, guttural sound that tore from Alex's throat, startled his team. Mike, who had been mid-bite into a croissant, froze, crumbs clinging to his beard. Sarah, engrossed in a tactical brief on her tablet, snapped her head up, her eyes wide with surprise. Ben, usually unflappable, nearly dropped his own coffee. "Sir!" Alex bellowed, his voice raw with a mixture of rage and fierce loyalty, cutting through the din of the terminal. The single word, sharp and authoritative, was less a question and more a declaration. It hung in the air, echoing off the high ceilings, drawing the attention of not only his team but several nearby passengers. All eyes were suddenly on Alex, then following his furious gaze, on the security checkpoint where Silas, his quiet dignity unwavering, endured the invasive search. The officer, startled by the sudden shout, paused, his hand still on Silas's back. For a split second, the world seemed to hold its breath. The rush of respect. The collective thud of gear bags hitting the polished floor resonated through the terminal, a sudden jarring punctuation to the low hum of airport activity. Heads turned, and conversations died mid-sentence as 6 imposing figures, their movements synchronized despite the urgency, broke into a controlled sprint. Alex, fueled by a potent cocktail of fury and unwavering loyalty, led the charge, his eyes locked onto the tableau at the security checkpoint. Officer Reynolds, emboldened by the perceived lack of challenge, had just snatched the small framed photograph from Silas's trembling hand, a sneer twisting his lips. "What's this, old man? Some kind of good luck charm?" he taunted, holding it up for the amusement of a nearby TSA agent who offered a weak, nervous chuckle. It was at this precise moment that Alex reached them, a whirlwind of tightly coiled muscle and righteous indignation. He didn't just stop. He arrived. His presence was a physical force, an immediate, unyielding barrier between Silas and Reynolds. Alex stood tall, his broad shoulders easily eclipsing Silas's slight frame, his gaze a glacial blue that promised retribution. Reynolds, caught mid-taunt, faltered, the photograph still clutched in his hand. He hadn't even heard them approach, so consumed was he by his petty tyranny. "Step back, officer." Alex's voice was a low growl, barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the din of the terminal like a sharpened blade. There was no question in his tone, only an absolute command. Reynolds, momentarily stunned by the sudden appearance of this formidable man, bristled. "Who the hell do you think you are? This is a security matter," he blustered, trying to regain his footing, his hand instinctively tightening on the photograph. Behind Alex, the rest of the SEAL team fanned out, forming an impenetrable crescent around Silas. Their faces, usually impassive, were now etched with a grim determination, their collective presence radiating an almost palpable energy that silenced the lingering murmurs of the passengers. The casual observers who, moments before, had been idly watching an old man's humiliation, now felt a distinct chill, a recognition of something far more significant unfolding. Alex ignored Reynolds' sputtering, his eyes fixed on the officer's hand, then flicked to Silas, a silent question passing between them. Silas, though pale, met Alex's gaze with a flicker of his old fire, a subtle nod confirming the insult. "Give him back his property," Alex stated, his voice gaining a chilling edge. "Now." Reynolds, caught between his ingrained authority and the sheer, overwhelming presence of Alex and his team, hesitated. He looked from Alex's unwavering stare to the faces of the other SEALs, each one a mirror of Alex's unyielding resolve. The air around them crackled with an unspoken threat, a promise of swift professional reprisal. The casual airport observer knew nothing of their training, but they intuitively understood the danger these men posed if provoked. "This man," Alex began, his voice rising, no longer a growl but a resonant declaration that echoed through the concourse, drawing every eye, "is not just an old man. He is a hero. He trained us. He is Ghost. Silas." A gasp rippled through the gathered passengers. The word hero hung in the air, a stark contrast to the earlier sneers and dismissive attitudes. Ghost Silas. The name, whispered and repeated, began to spread like wildfire. A few older veterans in the crowd, their eyes widening in recognition, straightened their postures. A silent acknowledgement of the legend. Reynolds' face drained of color. He finally, involuntarily, loosened his grip on the photograph. Alex's hand shot out, not snatching, but reclaiming it with a precise, almost tender movement, then gently placed it back into Silas's hand. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, officer," Alex continued, his voice now a dangerous calm. "This man instilled principles in us that saved lives. He taught us to fight, to survive, to uphold honor. He saved my life." The last words were spoken with an intensity that left no doubt of their truth, a raw, personal testament that resonated deeply. The murmurs from the crowd grew, shifting from curiosity to awe, then to a protective respect. The narrative had flipped. The humiliated old man was no longer just an inconvenience. He was a figure of reverence. The disrespect shown to him by Officer Reynolds now seemed not merely rude but sacrilegious. The passengers, once passive witnesses, now looked at Reynolds with open disdain. Reynolds, his bluster completely evaporated, could only stammer. He looked around wildly, seeking support, but found only condemnation in the faces of the onlookers and cold, unyielding fury in the eyes of the SEAL team. The power dynamics had shifted irrevocably. The officer, who had reveled in his petty authority, was now utterly exposed, his arrogance shattered by the sudden, overwhelming rush of respect for the man he had dared to demean. "You will apologize," Alex stated, his voice low, leaving no room for negotiation. "To him." Silas, clutching his photograph, looked up at Alex, a faint, grateful smile touching his lips. It was a silent conversation, a reaffirmation of the bond forged in trials, a testament to a loyalty that transcended rank and time. The Ghost had been recognized, and in that recognition the world around him had irrevocably changed. Honor restored. The oppressive silence that had fallen over the security checkpoint now thrummed with a new, potent energy. Officer Reynolds, his face a ghastly shade of white, fumbled with Mr. Silas's scattered belongings. His earlier bluster had evaporated, replaced by a desperate need to make himself small, invisible. The carefully folded sweater, the worn leather wallet, The innocuous, travel-sized toiletries. Each item was handled with a newfound reverence, a stark contrast to the rough dismissal they'd received moments before. His hands, which had so confidently rifled through the old man's bag, now trembled as he placed each item back into the small olive-green duffel. "My apologies, sir," he mumbled, the words barely audible above the low hum of the airport. His gaze darted everywhere but at Mr. Silas, or the unyielding stares of the SEAL team. The apology felt less like genuine contrition and more like a desperate incantation to banish the shame that clung to him like a shroud. He shoved the duffel bag back onto the conveyor belt with a final jerky motion, his shoulders hunched. Mr. Silas, no longer the stooped, deferential figure who had endured the officer's indignities, straightened to his full height. The slight tremble in his hands, a vestige of his earlier humiliation, vanished. His gaze, once downcast, now held a quiet strength, a steely resolve that belied his advanced years. The transformation was subtle but profound. He wasn't merely standing, he was reclaiming the space, the dignity that had been so casually stripped away. The fear that had tightened his jaw had loosened, replaced by a quiet pride. The surrounding passengers, who had been a frozen tableau of discomfort and morbid curiosity, stirred. Whispers rippled through the line, tinged with awe and a dawning understanding. They had witnessed not just a confrontation, but a reckoning. The elderly man, once a victim, now stood as a symbol of quiet resilience, his story unfolding before their eyes. Alex Spector Miller, his posture still rigid with protective fury, watched his mentor. The anger that had surged through him at Reynolds' disrespect began to recede, replaced by a profound sense of satisfaction. Justice, swift and undeniable, had been served. He saw the subtle shift in Mr. Silas's demeanor, the almost imperceptible lift of his chin, and knew that the old man's spirit, though tested, remained unbroken. The ghost was truly back. As Mr. Silas reached for his now reassembled duffel bag, his eyes met Alex's. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the old man's lips, a gesture of acknowledgement, of deep understanding that transcended words. It was a smile born of pride, of having stood firm in the face of adversity, and of knowing that he was not alone. Then, in a synchronized movement that was as powerful as it was unexpected, Alex and his entire SEAL team snapped to attention. Their backs were ramrod straight, their chins high. One by one, their right hands rose, palms flat, fingers together in a sharp, precise salute. The gesture was crisp, imbued with the weight of tradition, of unwavering respect. The air in the terminal seemed to thicken, charged with the unspoken deference. The click of their boots, the rustle of their uniforms, the sheer presence of these elite soldiers, all converged into a singular, undeniable display of honor. It was a silent crescendo, a thunderous affirmation of Mr. Silas's worth, his past, his legend. The passengers who had been observing the drama unfold gasped. Some covered their mouths, their eyes wide with disbelief and wonder. The sight of these formidable men, saluting an unassuming elderly gentleman, was a stark image of profound respect, an unexpected tableau in the mundane setting of an airport security line. Children, usually restless, stood mesmerized, their small hands clutching at their parents' clothes. Mr. Silas paused, his hand still resting on his bag. He took in the sight of the saluting team, his gaze sweeping over each man's face, a silent acknowledgement of their unwavering loyalty. His own eyes, which had seen so much and endured so much, held a depth of emotion that spoke volumes. The small, proud smile on his face widened just a fraction, a testament to a lifetime of service, of quiet heroism, now recognized and celebrated in the most public of arenas. The airport, usually a cacophony of announcements and bustling crowds, was momentarily hushed. The silent promise of honor hung heavy in the air, a testament to a man whose quiet dignity had been challenged, only to be restored with a reverence that resonated far beyond the confines of the security checkpoint. The incident, born of petty tyranny, had transformed into a powerful reaffirmation of respect, a moment etched into the collective memory of all who witnessed it. For Mr. Silas, it was more than just an apology. It was the world acknowledging the legend of the ghost,